Russian warships in British waters are not unusual. They transit through them, and Russian bombers flying, into the far north again is not unusual. They do that to test our air defences, and the ships are either transiting through or they're testing what's going on. We've also got the Russian spy ship Yantar in British waters operating as well, and hovering over critical national infrastructure, the cables that are going under the sea. But we've seen an unprecedented increase in activity, that is Russian activity against NATO nations. With a few weeks ago, there were a number of unusual commercial drone sightings over critical infrastructure in Germany. The Germans have pinned that down to the drones coming from some Russian shadow fleet ships that were going through German waters. We've had drones around Danish airfields where Denmark has had to close airfields. Again, it looks as if those are drones that have come from Russian shadow fleet ships sailing around Denmark. We've got reports today of similar drones around Swedish main naval base, and we had the Shahad 136 one-way attack drones, as you said, 19 of them going into Poland 10 days, 2 weeks ago, and we had MiG-31s violating Estonian airspace for 12 minutes before they were chased off by Italian F-35 fighter jets. This is a massive increase in Russian-related activity probing into NATO countries for two real reasons. The first one is they're trying to understand the political reaction and look at the level of political resolve there is within NATO and within the countries that are being probed. And the second thing is they're looking at the military and security reaction to see if there are any vulnerabilities there that at some stage in the future they could potentially exploit. And therefore, this is Russia throwing a pebble into the still NATO pond, looking for the ripples and watching what effect it has whenever they throw these pebbles in. It's significant that there's a lot of it happening one after each other. He's not desperate, and he's not vying for time. We're seeing an increase in the rhetoric where Russia is blaming NATO for its involvement in supporting Ukraine. He's turning around and trying to his domestic audience, suggest that it's not just Ukraine that the Russians are fighting; it's the whole of NATO. And we keep hearing that rhetoric increase coming out of even the likes of Foreign Minister Lavrov. That is something that Putin really wants to try and do, and therefore he's trying to stimulate a reaction or an overreaction from NATO, so that he can turn around to the Russian people and say, "Look, I told you so. This is a war against NATO." NATO, but at the same time, he's looking for cracks in the international community that he can then potentially exploit. And by exploiting those, hopefully try and set the conditions to take some of the pressure off Russia in the international community over what Russia's doing inside Ukraine. So it's a massive game of not just 3D chess but 5D chess. And when it comes to this geopolitical hybrid warfare or asymmetric warfare or sub-threshold warfare, the Russians are past masters at it. Well, we're seeing a lot of Putin's tactics at the moment. You mentioned undersea cables. The Russians are already damaging them and cutting them. You've mentioned when we talked about the drones and the aircraft incursions. The Russians have done that. We've talked about the probing with Russian warships and Russian strategic bombers into our airspace. That's been going on for years. And of course, in the UK, the Russians have used Novichok nerve agent on the streets of Salisbury, one of the most deadly substances known to man. And they have used polonium-210, poisoning Alexander Litvinenko in London as well, leaving a trail of radioactivity across our capital. As you mentioned, there's been Russian sabotage. There's been the attacks on DHL parcel depots in Germany and in the UK. There have been warehouses that have caught fire because they're storing equipment that's going to Ukraine, and that's been linked to Russian organized crime. So just about every tactic that the Russians could use, they are using at the moment, and add in cyber attacks and everything else. But what we're starting to see now is an increase in the volume of these attacks. It used to be that you'd get something and then nothing for 6, 9, 12, 24 months. But now we're seeing them virtually on a daily basis. And that's worrying, that uptick, because Putin is trying to distract countries from what's going on inside Ukraine, and trying to set the conditions to turn around to the Russian people and say, I told you this was a fight against NATO, and therefore all these losses are justified. I think Putin's getting worried, and I think this is a symbol of Putin getting worried. Testing of NATO is actually allowing NATO to improve itself. So, the invasion of Ukraine, the one thing that NATO had let slip was its defense industrial base. It thought that it could get supplies just in time from the United States and elsewhere. Well, there's been a wake-up call, and now Europe's defense industry is expanding rapidly. European nations are spending an awful lot more on defense, and therefore are going to be in a much greater set of readiness. The use of drones flying in has focused NATO into looking at how you deal with the drone threat, and whether they be the Shahad one-way attack drones. You're shooting a $100,000 drone down with a missile that costs £1.5 million isn't economically viable, and therefore the Poles and others are looking at anti-drone drones, and they're copying Ukrainian technology, and the Ukrainians are actually training NATO troops and security forces in the use of drones, which is a significant move forward. So NATO's resolve is coming together better. NATO's capabilities are improving, and all of this is down to what Vladimir Putin is doing. And Putin was saying that and suggesting that NATO was a threat to Russia. Well, if anything, he's just increased NATO's capabilities, and therefore, that perceived threat from his perspective is nothing but increasing. I think he's gained a huge amount of knowledge, but then NATO's gained some knowledge as well. NATO's gained a wake-up call, and therefore that's why we're seeing a change in the air defense postures in Poland, and the NATO countries that are in direct line of Russian activity. That's why we're seeing the resolve coming out of the NATO Secretary General today, saying that they will shoot down Russian aircraft that come in. You always have to send a warning, first of all, before you then do it. So the Russians know it's coming, and it'll happen. The last time a NATO country shot down a Russian aircraft was the Turks, when a Russian aircraft had entered Turkish airspace when it was flying over Syria. The Turks had warned them beforehand. The Russians had gone into Turkish airspace several times. The Turks warned them, said, if that happens again, we're going to shoot you down. It happened again, and they shot the aircraft down, and it didn't lead to World War III. And therefore, NATO has now turned around and said to the Russians, if you do this again, we're going to shoot you down. And if we do, which we should do, it'll not lead to World War III. But we've also seen an unprecedented 2 Article 4s being called by 2 different nations in NATO, Poland and Estonia. And Denmark is talking about calling an Article 4 meeting around the drone incursions. This is unprecedented. And Article 4 is NATO countries getting together collectively to collectively show their anger at what is happening, and it's a collective stiff letter and collective waggling of the finger. But in geopolitical terms, it's quite a strong move, and it's allowed the NATO countries to agree together that they can set the rules of engagement. That if the Russians do come into NATO airspace, then NATO countries have collectively said that they can be shot down. This is something that negotiations will go on behind closed doors, because every nation, no matter whether you're part of NATO or not, every nation carries a red card. They don't have to do everything that NATO agrees, and this is where getting together and discussing things and coming up with a collective finger waggling and stiff letter is good, because that everyone's on the same piece of paper.